Imagine horrifyingly discovering that entirely for 8 agonizing years, your elite, highly successful husband has been violently, secretly ashamed of you. That he confidently attends the absolute most exclusive, high society events in the massive city completely alone, maliciously inventing highly toxic excuses as to exactly why his wife absolutely never, ever appears. And infinitely, catastrophically worse, that there is absolutely another younger, highly glamorous woman whom he has been proudly introducing as his brand new fiancée entirely to the absolute highest elite of society. Today, I am actively going to explicitly tell you the explosive story of Eleanor Davis, and exactly what she brutally did with that catastrophic discovery will leave you completely, utterly speechless. Welcome back, my beautiful family. If you fiercely love highly explosive stories about massive betrayal, brilliant transformations, and the absolute ultimate, cold-blooded revenge, you absolutely must hear this incredible story. Please smash that like button, subscribe to our channel, and let me know exactly what you would do in Eleanor's highly terrifying situation down in the comments. Let's actively dive completely into The Ice Heiress, The Ultimate Reckoning, The Gilded Cage of Lies. Eleanor Davis had absolutely always profoundly known that something massive was highly, toxically wrong, but she could absolutely never, ever pinpoint exactly what it truly was. On a highly freezing, bitter November morning entirely in massive New York City, she intensely looked completely out the massive window of her highly elegant, multi-million-dollar penthouse entirely on the exclusive Upper East Side, intensely watching highly impeccable, bespoke-suited executives confidently walk directly down Fifth Avenue toward their elite corporate offices. She physically felt the highly familiar, crushing weight entirely of the absolute loneliness that had violently been her only loyal companion entirely for agonizing years. The massive penthouse was completely, utterly immaculate. Flawlessly decorated completely with the exact same, highly discreet, expensive taste that Alexander Montgomery, her highly arrogant husband, absolutely always aggressively demanded. Elite Italian designer furniture, highly neutral, cold tones, absolutely everything meticulously coordinated entirely to flawlessly reflect the highly pristine status of an elite, incredibly successful executive. But Eleanor profoundly felt exactly like a highly pathetic stranger, entirely in her absolute own home. A highly temporary, unwanted guest, entirely in a massive hotel that was way too incredibly expensive entirely for her. Alexander Montgomery had confidently left incredibly early, exactly as he absolutely always flawlessly did. At exactly 42 arrogant years old, he was officially the elite senior partner entirely at Montgomery & Associates, a highly ruthless strategic consulting firm that heavily served absolutely some of the absolute largest, most massive corporations entirely in the country. Highly imposing, incredibly tall, completely with flawlessly trimmed silver fox hair, and absolutely always impeccably dressed, entirely in highly expensive, bespoke tailored suits, completely from Madison Avenue's absolute best tailors. Alexander was exactly the highly terrifying type of man who aggressively commanded absolute, immediate respect, the absolute microsecond he confidently entered a massive room. Eleanor, at exactly 34 young years old, was the complete, absolute opposite. Originally completely from a highly quiet, small town entirely in upstate Vermont, She had bravely moved directly to massive New York City at exactly 20 years old, entirely to enthusiastically study modern languages completely at elite Columbia University. Exactly there, she beautifully met Alexander entirely at a highly exclusive graduation party. He was absolutely already highly professionally, successfully established. She was a highly innocent, young dreamer, completely fascinated entirely by the massive, blinding lights of the big city. Their beautiful courtship was an absolute, highly magical fairy tale. Alexander aggressively courted her completely, with a highly intoxicating sophistication that she had absolutely never, ever miraculously experienced. Highly exclusive dinners, entirely at the absolute most expensive Michelin-starred restaurants. Beautiful, romantic weekends, entirely in the highly elite Hamptons. Highly expensive, massive gifts that beautifully made her violently blush. Eleanor profoundly felt exactly like a highly innocent Cinderella. A highly simple, beautiful girl, miraculously elevated completely into a highly exclusive world, entirely of massive luxury and absolute refinement, that had absolutely always visually seemed completely, utterly inaccessible. They happily married exactly 2 beautiful years, significantly later, entirely in a highly small, but incredibly elegant, beautiful ceremony, entirely at a historic Manhattan cathedral. Eleanor flawlessly wore a highly simple, but breathtakingly beautiful dress she had proudly bought completely with her highly modest student savings. Alexander aggressively paid entirely for the highly lavish reception completely at a highly luxurious, private estate perfectly on the absolute outskirts, entirely of the massive city, completely for exactly 50 highly meticulously, carefully selected guests. Absolutely all, entirely from his highly elite, social, and professional corporate circles. In the highly beautiful early years entirely of their marriage, Eleanor absolutely still fiercely maintained the highly pathetic hope entirely of successfully integrating completely into Alexander's massive, elite world. She enthusiastically studied complex etiquette. She highly meticulously learned absolutely all about highly expensive, fine vintage wines. And she desperately attempted to aggressively develop a highly genuine interest entirely in highly complex contemporary art, but highly gradually, incredibly slowly. Alexander aggressively began to highly toxically dissuade her completely from actively attending highly elite social events. "You would be incredibly, highly bored, my beautiful darling," he would toxically say, absolutely every single time they successfully received highly exclusive invitations directly to elite charity galas, massive exhibition openings, or highly important corporate business dinners. They are incredibly formal, highly stiff events, completely filled entirely with highly boring corporate business talk that you profoundly know absolutely nothing about. You highly prefer to peacefully stay completely at home, entirely with your heavy books. Absolutely. Right? Eleanor highly naively believed him, or highly desperately wanted to blindly believe him. She highly submissively accepted the highly toxic excuses entirely because the highly terrifying alternative that her absolute own husband was highly, violently ashamed entirely of her was way too incredibly, catastrophically unthinkable to bravely confront. She highly successfully specialized entirely in highly complex, technical, and literary translation. Brutally working entirely as a highly successful freelancer, completely for highly small publishing houses and corporate companies. It was a highly quiet job. She could effortlessly do completely from home, completely alone, completely without ever violently interrupting Alexander's highly massive, elite social agenda. Incredibly slowly, Eleanor violently became completely, utterly invisible, even entirely to her absolute own self. The devastating discovery that highly freezing November morning, exactly as she was meticulously organizing Alexander's massive home office entirely for the highly expensive cleaning lady, Eleanor successfully found absolutely something highly massive that would completely, violently change her entire life, completely forever. A highly expensive, gold-embossed envelope, highly carelessly forgotten, completely between highly complex, elite commercial contracts. It was a highly exclusive invitation directly to the massive annual gala, entirely of the Manhattan Modern Art Foundation. Exactly one of the absolute most highly prestigious, elite events entirely in the massive city. Flawlessly held entirely at the highly sumptuous Metropolitan Museum of Art. The highly expensive invitation was explicitly dated exactly 3 agonizing weeks completely ago. Eleanor vividly, highly agonizingly remembered that exact specific night, completely perfectly. Alexander had highly toxically explicitly told her he possessed a highly tedious, massive business dinner, completely with highly demanding German clients. And he had confidently returned completely home at exactly 3 a.m., completely with his massive heart violently racing. Eleanor aggressively grabbed her expensive laptop and frantically searched entirely for the massive event online. Immediately, literally dozens entirely of highly glossy social photos violently popped completely up, entirely on the highly elite New York high society news websites. Highly beautiful photos entirely of highly elegant power couples. Highly dazzling, stunning women entirely in elite haute couture gowns. Highly distinguished, powerful men entirely in bespoke tuxedos. And then she vividly saw him, Alexander, visually looking absolutely, incredibly radiant, entirely in his highly impeccable, bespoke tuxedo, completely with his strong arm, highly possessively, intimately wrapped completely around the highly delicate waist, entirely of a beautiful woman that Eleanor had absolutely never, ever vividly seen. A highly spectacular, striking blonde, entirely of exactly around 28 young years old, flawlessly wearing a highly stunning, crimson-red designer dress that easily cost significantly more than Eleanor's absolute entire annual salary. She was incredibly tall, highly slender, completely with the exact type of highly polished, flawless beauty that absolutely only massive cold money can successfully buy. The highly glossy caption violently hit her exactly like a highly brutal, physical punch directly to the heavy stomach. Elite businessman Alexander Montgomery and his beautiful companion, the highly famous digital influencer and model Chloe Bennett, arriving at the Modern Art Foundation Gala. Eleanor frantically, aggressively clicked directly on significantly more highly damning photos. Alexander and Chloe happily toasting completely with highly expensive Dom Perignon. Alexander highly intimately whispering absolutely something directly into her delicate ear, exactly as she laughed loudly. Alexander highly proudly introducing her directly to completely other elite power couples entirely of his highly exclusive social circle, completely with highly evident, massive pride. Eleanor's soft hands were violently trembling exactly as she frantically opened Chloe Bennett's highly curated Instagram profile. The highly toxic profile officially possessed exactly 340,000 highly active followers, and it was an absolute, massive showcase entirely of highly obscene, elite luxury. highly stunning photos entirely on massive mega yachts, completely in St. Bart's. Highly expensive trips directly to the massive Maldives. Highly exclusive Hermes bags. Highly massive, expensive sports cars. Highly romantic dinners, entirely in elite Michelin-starred restaurants. In several highly recent glossy photos, Eleanor horrifyingly recognized highly specific details that completely, violently shattered her. The highly expensive, massive Rolex watch that Alexander had highly toxically explicitly told her a highly wealthy client had generously gifted him. The highly expensive, beautiful pearl necklace that highly mysteriously appeared entirely in his expensive jewelry box exactly 6 agonizing months completely ago. Exactly when Alexander highly toxically lied and explicitly said it was a highly secret surprise anniversary gift, entirely for a highly important client's wife. The highly exotic, expensive flowers that highly mysteriously arrived directly to their massive house, allegedly, entirely by absolute mistake, completely from the highly elite florist. Absolutely. Everything was actively being highly expensively bought, completely for Chloe entirely, with massive money that absolutely should have legally been theirs. Eleanor aggressively continued her highly agonizing investigation completely with the highly toxic obsession entirely of absolutely someone who desperately needs to explicitly know the absolute, entire, massive extent entirely of her absolute own, complete humiliation. She horrifyingly discovered that Alexander and Chloe highly frequently visited the absolute most highly exclusive, elite restaurants entirely in massive New York, completely together. She successfully found highly damning photos, entirely of them completely at highly elite events, that actively occurred exactly while Alexander was highly, supposedly entirely, on highly stressful business trips. A highly romantic weekend, entirely in Aspen. Absolutely another highly expensive trip entirely to the highly luxurious French Riviera. The absolute worst, most highly devastating revelation violently arrived exactly when Eleanor successfully found a highly exclusive magazine interview completely with Chloe entirely in a highly prestigious American fashion magazine, officially published exactly 2 agonizing months completely prior. In the highly toxic article, Chloe spoke highly vaguely, but incredibly revealingly entirely about her highly perfect love life. I have actively been entirely with a highly wonderful, incredible man, entirely for significantly over a massive year, Chloe happily stated. He is significantly older, highly, incredibly successful, and he flawlessly treats me exactly like an absolute queen. It is completely, utterly different, entirely from absolutely any relationship I have absolutely ever possessed. He flawlessly possesses a highly attractive maturity and absolute stability that actively makes me physically feel incredibly secure. When the highly intrusive interviewer explicitly asked entirely about a massive marriage, Chloe highly arrogantly responded, "Well, his highly personal situation is incredibly complicated. He was highly legally married, but he was absolutely already completely, emotionally separated entirely for a highly long, agonizing time, exactly when we beautifully met. Exactly now. It is absolutely only a highly brief matter entirely of massive time, completely before absolutely everything flawlessly becomes highly official." Eleanor agonizingly read those highly toxic, heavy words, physically feeling exactly as if her entire, massive world was violently crumbling completely around her. Alexander had highly toxically explicitly told Chloe that they were completely, officially, separated entirely, for significantly, over a massive year, entirely, while he actively slept entirely in the exact same massive bed, completely with Eleanor. Actively kissed her perfectly every single morning, completely before grueling work. And actively made passionate love completely to her, entirely on highly lazy, peaceful weekends. He was meticulously, aggressively building a completely, entirely parallel massive life. It absolutely wasn't entirely just a highly pathetic physical affair. It was a highly serious, completely public, and highly recognized absolute relationship. At least, entirely to absolutely everyone, completely. Except entirely for Eleanor. She frantically ran directly to the highly expensive bathroom and violently vomited. Then she sat heavily, completely on the freezing cold marble floor, violently crying completely until she legally possessed absolutely zero hot tears, completely left to actively shed. When she finally, exhaustedly stood completely up and intensely looked directly at herself, completely in the massive mirror, she vividly saw a highly pathetic woman she absolutely did not completely recognize. Her beautiful eyes were violently swollen, her pale face highly blotchy, and she flawlessly possessed the highly terrified expression entirely of absolutely someone who had literally just horrifyingly discovered that her absolute entire massive life was a highly toxic, massive lie. Eleanor just discovered her entire marriage is a lie. What would you do in this exact moment? Confront him immediately or plan revenge? Tell us below. The master plan. Alexander confidently arrived completely home at exactly 7 p.m., exactly as he absolutely always flawlessly did. He highly distractedly kissed Eleanor's pale cheek, exactly as he absolutely always flawlessly did. He highly arrogantly asked exactly what was completely ready, entirely for massive dinner, exactly as he absolutely always flawlessly did. It was exactly as if absolutely nothing massive had violently changed. Exactly as if Eleanor's entire, massive world absolutely had not literally just violently fallen completely apart. During the highly quiet dinner, Eleanor intensely observed him exactly as if she were actively seeing him entirely for the absolute first time. The highly calculated, toxic way he smoothly talked entirely about his highly stressful day, highly meticulously omitting absolutely any highly specific detail that could highly possibly connect him completely to Chloe. The highly evasive way he actively avoided her piercing gaze. The highly annoying way his expensive phone highly constantly vibrated completely with secret messages that he highly discreetly checked. Absolutely always completely with a highly small, toxic smile perfectly on his handsome lips. After the massive dinner, Alexander highly toxically stated he desperately needed to actively review highly complex contracts entirely in his massive office and aggressively closed the heavy door. Eleanor profoundly knew he was actively talking completely to Chloe. That exact night, heavily lying, completely next, completely to the exact toxic man who had actively been highly maliciously deceiving her entirely for significantly over a massive year. Eleanor fiercely made a highly massive, life-altering decision that would completely, violently change absolutely everything. She would absolutely not aggressively confront Alexander completely immediately. Absolutely first, she would aggressively discover the absolute entire brutal truth. And completely after that, she would highly aggressively make Alexander violently pay entirely for every single toxic humiliation. Entirely for every single malicious lie. Entirely for every single highly toxic moment he actively made her physically feel completely inadequate. entirely, while he meticulously built a highly fake fairy tale life, completely with absolutely another woman. The highly agonizing following days were a highly terrifying descent, completely into the absolute hell, entirely, of highly progressive, massive discovery. Eleanor violently became a highly elite, private detective, entirely of her absolute own, shattered life. And every single, highly damning brand new piece entirely of toxic evidence was exactly like a significantly deeper, highly lethal stab, completely into her absolutely already violently destroyed self-esteem. She aggressively began completely by highly meticulously reviewing their highly secure, massive joint bank statements, which she had absolutely always legally possessed absolute access completely to, but had absolutely never, ever actively used entirely, because she completely, blindly trusted him completely. Exactly what she horrifyingly found violently provoked intense nausea. In the absolute last 18 agonizing months, Alexander had highly illegally, secretly spent, miraculously, almost $85,000 entirely on highly vague client entertainment and highly suspicious business travel. But Eleanor could highly easily, flawlessly trace highly many entirely of these massive transactions. Highly expensive dinners, entirely. In the absolute most highly exclusive restaurants, entirely in massive New York, strictly for exactly 2 people. Highly expensive luxury shopping sprees, entirely on Fifth Avenue, completely at Prada and Gucci. Highly romantic weekends, entirely in luxury hotels. Absolutely always highly specifically reserved, entirely for a highly romantic couple. There was absolutely even a highly massive transaction, entirely of exactly $15,000, entirely at Tiffany & Co. On the exact same, highly specific date that Chloe had highly proudly published a highly glossy photo entirely of a massive diamond bracelet, completely with the highly toxic caption, "Highly special, massive gift, completely from absolutely someone highly special." But the highly catastrophic financial discoveries were absolutely only the highly terrifying beginning. Eleanor successfully found a highly damning search history entirely on the massive, shared iPad that Alexander had highly carelessly forgotten to completely erase. Highly romantic luxury hotels, entirely in Aspen. Highly exclusive restaurants, entirely on the French Riviera. Highly expensive jewelry, completely for a 28-year-old woman. Exactly how to safely end a massive marriage completely without violently losing massive money. The absolute last, highly toxic search was explicitly dated exactly 2 agonizing months completely ago. Alexander absolutely wasn't entirely just actively cheating. He was meticulously, aggressively planning to completely, violently leave her. One highly rainy afternoon, exactly when Alexander highly toxically stated he was actively in a highly stressful, all-day off-site meeting, Eleanor fiercely decided to aggressively follow him. She rapidly took a cheap yellow taxi directly to his massive corporate office perfectly near Midtown. Alexander confidently walked completely out at exactly 2 p.m. Absolutely not entirely in his massive black car, but entirely on foot. Confidently walking directly toward a highly exclusive area, entirely of highly elegant restaurants, Eleanor aggressively followed him, flawlessly maintaining a highly safe distance completely, with her massive heart violently beating so incredibly hard, she was absolutely sure completely other normal people entirely on the busy street could clearly hear it. Alexander confidently entered a highly classic, incredibly exclusive chic cafe. Chloe was absolutely already, eagerly waiting completely for him. Eleanor frantically hid completely behind a massive stone column and intensely observed a highly romantic scene that completely, violently destroyed her. Alexander and Chloe highly passionately greeted absolutely each other completely with a highly intimate, deep kiss. The exact, highly passionate kind that absolutely leaves zero microscopic doubt entirely about their highly absolute intimacy. They sat heavily entirely at a highly private, reserved table. Highly clearly absolute regular customers. Eleanor could vividly see them highly animatedly talking. Alexander was loudly laughing entirely in a highly genuine way that she had absolutely not heard him actively laugh entirely in agonizing years. His piercing eyes brilliantly shone exactly when he intensely looked directly at Chloe. He highly intimately held her soft hand completely across the small table, playfully playing completely with her delicate fingers, flawlessly treating her completely with a highly pure tenderness that Eleanor had completely forgotten actually existed at exactly one highly specific moment. Alexander smoothly pulled a highly small, iconic blue Tiffany box completely out, entirely of his expensive pocket, and gently handed it directly to Chloe. She rapidly opened it completely with a highly genuine look, entirely of absolute ecstasy, and excitedly put exactly what visually looked exactly like a highly expensive, massive ring perfectly on the ring finger entirely of her right hand. It absolutely wasn't an official engagement ring. Alexander was absolutely still legally married, completely after all. But it was highly clearly an absolute, highly toxic promise entirely of a massive future. Eleanor intensely observed entirely for miraculously almost 2 agonizing hours. She vividly saw exactly how Alexander flawlessly treated Chloe exactly like an absolute queen. Exactly how he hung completely on every single, exactly one entirely of her highly toxic words. Exactly how he intensely looked directly at her completely, with a highly pure adoration he had absolutely never, ever shown entirely to Eleanor. It was highly, incredibly obvious that he was completely, deeply, entirely in pure love, and that somehow violently hurt significantly more than the highly toxic betrayal itself. Eleanor could highly possibly have successfully dealt completely with a highly soulless, pathetic physical affair, but Alexander had genuinely fallen completely in pure love, completely, with absolutely another woman, and had successfully built completely with her the exact type entirely of highly beautiful relationship that Eleanor had absolutely always beautifully dreamed entirely of actively having, completely with him. On the highly quiet taxi ride completely back home, Eleanor violently cried completely in absolute silence, intensely watching the busy streets entirely of New York City violently pass completely by, entirely, through the wet window. The massive city, which had exactly once absolutely been highly synonymous, completely with her beautiful dreams, exactly now, visually looked exactly like a highly terrifying graveyard, entirely of violently lost illusions. That exact night, Alexander arrived completely home at exactly 7:30 p.m. Exactly half an agonizing hour, significantly later than highly usual. He highly toxically, explicitly stated that the massive meeting had run incredibly long, and he was completely exhausted. They ate highly silently, exactly as had violently become their highly toxic custom, entirely in the absolute last agonizing years. Eleanor intensely observed him highly discreetly, and highly vividly noticed the highly toxic signs she had absolutely always blindly ignored. The highly calculated way he highly constantly checked his expensive phone. Absolutely always aggressively putting the glowing screen completely face down exactly when absolutely someone highly secretly messaged him. The highly suspicious way he immediately aggressively showered exactly upon arriving completely home, entirely too highly relaxed, completely from the grueling workday. The highly toxic way his expensive clothes highly occasionally aggressively smelled entirely of expensive women's perfume, which he highly toxically explained completely away entirely by explicitly saying it was simply from highly close clients or female coworkers. After the massive dinner, Alexander highly toxically stated he desperately needed to actively work incredibly late, completely from home. Eleanor safely went directly to the massive bedroom and pathetically pretended to absolutely be deeply asleep. Around exactly 11 p.m., she clearly heard Alexander actively talking incredibly softly, completely on the expensive phone entirely in his massive office. She quietly got completely out entirely of the massive bed and slowly approached the heavy door. "No, my beautiful love. You profoundly know it absolutely isn't exactly like that," Alexander highly toxically whispered. "It is highly complicated. Eleanor is incredibly fragile. If I aggressively ask entirely for the brutal divorce right exactly now, she could highly likely violently possess a highly massive nervous breakdown. You absolutely do not completely know her. She is completely, utterly dependent entirely on me." A highly pregnant, toxic pause. "Absolutely. Of course I desperately want to actively be completely with you officially. You are the absolute woman entirely of my entire life. But I desperately need to actively do exactly this, entirely the absolute right way. Highly gradually. She desperately needs to highly slowly get completely used, entirely, to the massive idea." Absolutely another toxic pause. "I completely know it is incredibly difficult entirely for you completely too. But darling, I profoundly know you fiercely deserve significantly more than actively having me completely hidden. But deeply think entirely about exactly what we have successfully achieved completely together, entirely, in this massive time. Your elite career has violently taken completely off, and exactly when we are officially completely together, I will fiercely ensure that the absolute entire high society entirely of massive New York profoundly knows that you are officially my beautiful woman." Eleanor heavily leaned completely against the highly cold wall, entirely in the dark hallway, her weak legs violently trembling. Alexander absolutely wasn't entirely just actively planning to violently leave her. He was meticulously, aggressively planning a highly calculated strategy entirely to flawlessly do it completely in a highly specific way that highly maliciously minimized absolutely any massive damage completely to his pristine, social, or highly professional elite reputation. Next massive week is the highly exclusive Prada Foundation event, Alexander aggressively continued. I will happily take you exactly as absolutely always, and exactly who profoundly knows. It could highly possibly be a highly excellent opportunity entirely to aggressively begin actively talking significantly, more highly openly, entirely about our massive future completely together. Eleanor safely returned directly to the massive bedroom completely, with her fragile heart completely broken. She heavily lay completely down, entirely in the exact same bed she intimately shared completely with a highly toxic man, who actively saw her entirely as a highly pathetic obstacle, completely to his pure happiness. A highly pathetic, dead weight entirely, of which he desperately needed to meticulously dispose, entirely, of incredibly carefully, entirely so as absolutely not to violently damage his pristine image. For the absolute first time, completely, since horrifyingly discovering the highly massive betrayal, Eleanor profoundly felt absolutely something significantly more than just massive pain. She felt absolute, white-hot rage, a highly freezing, incredibly calculating, lethal ire aggressively began to violently burn completely in her heavy chest, exactly like a highly slow, but completely constant, massive fire. Alexander highly arrogantly thought she was way too incredibly fragile to successfully handle the absolute brutal truth. He arrogantly thought she was way too incredibly dependent entirely to successfully survive completely without him. He arrogantly thought he could highly maliciously manipulate the entire massive situation entirely to flawlessly come completely out exactly as the highly noble, good guy who highly charitably took absolute care entirely of a highly problematic, pathetic wife, completely, until he successfully found a highly suitable, convenient solution. Eleanor smiled incredibly darkly, completely in the pitch-black darkness. Alexander was actively about to horrifyingly discover exactly how incredibly, catastrophically wrong he absolutely was, as entirely about the exact woman he had highly foolishly married. Eleanor just found out Alexander's master plan to leave her. What should her first move be? Tell us below. The metamorphosis. Eleanor violently woke completely up the absolute next morning, completely with a highly razor-sharp mental clarity she had absolutely not miraculously felt entirely in agonizing years. For the absolute first time, completely since the highly toxic discovery, she absolutely did not violently cry. She absolutely did not physically feel the highly familiar, crushing weight entirely of toxic depression. Instead, she profoundly felt absolutely something significantly, infinitely more highly powerful. Absolute, lethal determination. While Alexander actively showered highly happily humming, highly likely meticulously planning absolutely another highly romantic date, completely with Chloe, Eleanor flawlessly drafted a highly massive, absolute master plan. She would absolutely not aggressively confront Alexander completely immediately. That would simply generously give him absolute, immediate control entirely of the massive situation, generously allowing him to highly maliciously manipulate the highly toxic narrative completely to his absolute favor. Instead, Eleanor would aggressively do absolutely something that Alexander would absolutely never, ever highly possibly expect. She would completely, violently transform herself completely into the exact, highly sophisticated woman he absolutely always toxically claimed she absolutely wasn't incredibly sophisticated enough to successfully be. She aggressively began completely by highly meticulously investigating absolutely all the highly elite social events entirely, to which Alexander had confidently attended completely without her entirely in the absolute last, exactly 2 agonizing years. She horrifyingly discovered a highly impressive, toxic pattern. Highly exclusive charity galas, massive elite exhibition openings, highly exclusive corporate business dinners, highly expensive luxury product launch parties. Absolutely all highly elite events, exactly where the highly visible presence entirely of an elegant, sophisticated wife was absolutely not only highly expected, but absolutely essential entirely to flawlessly maintain highly pristine social status. Alexander had confidently taken Chloe directly to absolutely every single exactly one entirely of these massive events, highly toxically presenting her highly occasionally exactly as a close friend, highly occasionally exactly as a professional consultant, highly occasionally exactly as a companion. But Eleanor profoundly knew completely from the highly toxic comments she successfully found entirely on highly exclusive social media that absolutely everyone entirely in his highly elite social circle profoundly knew exactly what the highly true nature entirely of their toxic relationship absolutely was. The absolute, most highly shocking, massive discovery violently arrived exactly when Eleanor highly illegally obtained absolute access completely to Alexander's highly secure WhatsApp messages, completely through his highly synced, shared iPad. The highly toxic conversations completely with Chloe flawlessly revealed absolutely not only the massive magnitude entirely of the brutal betrayal, but absolutely also the highly shocking, absolute cruelty completely with which Alexander toxically spoke entirely about Eleanor. She is actively beginning to highly suspiciously suspect Alexander had highly toxically written directly to Chloe exactly 3 agonizing weeks completely before. She explicitly asked me exactly why I absolutely never, ever actively take her directly to my elite corporate events. And exactly what did you explicitly tell her? Chloe had highly toxically responded. The absolute truth. That she absolutely wouldn't profoundly know exactly how to flawlessly behave. That she would absolutely be completely, utterly lost, completely among highly sophisticated people. That it is significantly better, entirely for absolutely everyone exactly, if she simply peacefully stays completely at home, actively doing her highly pathetic, tiny little translations. Ah, poor highly pathetic thing. It absolutely must be highly horrific to successfully be married entirely to absolutely someone who is so incredibly, violently ashamed entirely of you. It absolutely isn't toxic shame, my beautiful love. It is absolute realism. Eleanor completely comes entirely from a highly simple, pathetic family. She absolutely never, ever successfully learned the highly necessary, complex social codes entirely for our massive world. It is exactly like actively taking absolutely someone who absolutely only intimately knows highly cheap, pathetic table wine directly to an exclusive 1985 vintage elite tasting. Eleanor agonizingly read these highly toxic messages, physically feeling a highly explosive mixture entirely of massive pain and absolute, blinding indignation that completely surprised her entirely by its pure, unadulterated intensity. Alexander absolutely wasn't entirely just actively cheating completely on her. He absolutely, totally despised her. He maliciously despised her highly simple origins, her pure simplicity, her absolute authenticity. But there was absolutely significantly more. Sometimes I highly deeply think entirely about exactly how incredibly different absolutely everything would truly be exactly if I had miraculously met you absolutely first, Alexander had highly toxically written. You profoundly understand my massive world entirely in a highly beautiful way that Eleanor absolutely never, ever will. When we are flawlessly together, entirely at highly elite events, I profoundly feel incredibly proud. Highly important people actively congratulate me. They highly admire my impeccable good taste. Completely with Eleanor, I absolutely always profoundly feel exactly like I am actively doing her a highly massive, pathetic favor. When exactly are you actively going to officially permanently leave her? Chloe had highly toxically asked. I am actively waiting entirely for the absolute right, perfect moment. Eleanor possesses absolutely zero massive resources entirely of her absolute own. If I aggressively ask entirely for the brutal divorce right exactly now, she could highly maliciously cause massive problems, expensively hire highly elite lawyers, actively try to violently damage me highly professionally. It is significantly better to aggressively prepare the highly toxic ground incredibly slowly. What exact specific kind entirely of massive preparation? Actively making her highly organically realize completely by herself that we absolutely no longer successfully work. Making her actively take the highly dramatic initiative entirely to permanently end it. Exactly that highly specific way. I am officially the highly noble, good guy who desperately attempted to magically save his failing marriage. And you are officially the highly beautiful woman who miraculously helped me completely through a highly difficult, tragic separation. The highly freezing, absolute calculating cruelty entirely of Alexander was completely, utterly breathtaking. He had highly maliciously, meticulously planned absolutely every single microscopic detail entirely of the complete destruction, entirely of his absolute own marriage, entirely to fiercely preserve his pristine reputation and aggressively maximize his massive chances completely with Chloe. Eleanor highly meticulously printed absolutely all these highly toxic conversations and fiercely guarded them incredibly safely. Then, she aggressively began the highly massive second phase entirely of her absolute master plan. The transformation. Her absolute first massive stop was completely on Fifth Avenue. The absolute, highly exclusive Golden Mile entirely of massive New York. She confidently entered a highly exclusive Prada boutique and highly aggressively asked entirely to actively speak completely with the absolute most highly experienced, elite personal shopper. I desperately need an absolute, complete, highly massive transformation, Eleanor explicitly stated directly to Marina. A highly elegant, sophisticated woman entirely in her early 50s, who immediately, flawlessly evaluated Eleanor completely with highly professional, piercing eyes. What exact specific kind entirely of massive transformation, madam? I desperately want to successfully be completely, utterly unrecognizable. I desperately want to completely transform entirely into the exact type entirely of highly terrifying woman who violently commands absolute attention exactly when she confidently enters a massive room. Marina smiled highly knowingly. May I highly politely ask exactly what is the highly special occasion? Absolute, total revenge, Eleanor replied completely, without a single ounce entirely of hesitation. They aggressively spent exactly 3 highly intense hours entirely in the exclusive boutique. Eleanor aggressively bought exactly 2 highly stunning cocktail dresses, a highly breathtaking elite gala gown that easily cost significantly more than her absolute entire income entirely for exactly 6 grueling months, exactly as a highly skilled translator. Highly expensive Christian Louboutin stilettos, elite designer bags, and highly exclusive accessories. She highly aggressively spent exactly $25,000 completely from their highly secure, massive joint account. Massive money that Alexander highly arrogantly thought she absolutely didn't even completely know miraculously existed. Next, she confidently went directly to the absolute best, most highly exclusive beauty salon entirely in Manhattan. She highly aggressively demanded a completely absolute, total makeover. Violently cut, absolutely all the highly pathetic length completely off. she explicitly told the highly elite hairstylist. "I desperately want a highly sharp, incredibly modern, highly powerful bob. And I desperately want highly bright, golden highlights. I desperately want to visually look exactly like a highly terrifying woman who absolutely accepts zero pathetic excuses." The elite hairstylist, a highly dramatic, brilliant man, explicitly named Francesco, was completely, utterly enthusiastic, completely about the massive project. "Oh, my beautiful darling, you absolutely possess an incredibly, highly flawless bone structure, completely with the absolute right, perfect cut. You will absolutely be completely, utterly devastating." Exactly 5 highly agonizing hours significantly later, Eleanor intensely looked directly at herself completely in the massive mirror, and absolutely did not vividly recognize the highly terrifying woman who intensely looked directly back. The highly sharp, modern hair flawlessly framed her beautiful face perfectly, beautifully highlighting her piercing green eyes and her striking cheekbones. The highly bright, golden highlights beautifully gave her a highly sophisticated, expensive glow she had absolutely never, ever successfully possessed. But the absolute, highly most massive transformation was completely internal. For the absolute first time, completely in agonizing years, Eleanor profoundly felt incredibly beautiful, highly terrifyingly powerful, and absolutely, undeniably valuable. She confidently returned completely home, heavily carrying highly numerous, massive shopping bags. Alexander absolutely had not successfully arrived completely yet. He was highly likely actively with Chloe. Eleanor aggressively hid absolutely all the highly expensive purchases securely in the massive closet entirely of the guest room, and aggressively returned directly to her highly meticulous research. She horrifyingly discovered that the highly anticipated next massive week was officially the highly exclusive Winter Gala entirely of the Modern Art Foundation. Exactly one of the absolute most highly important, elite events entirely of the massive New York social season, completely according entirely to Alexander's highly toxic history. It was an absolute, 100% highly guaranteed certainty that he would highly arrogantly take Chloe. Eleanor aggressively investigated the massive event and successfully discovered that it was highly possible entirely to aggressively buy highly exclusive individual VIP tickets entirely for exactly $500, completely without a single ounce of hesitation. She aggressively bought a highly exclusive ticket, actively using her absolute own, highly personal credit card. That exact night, exactly when Alexander arrived completely home at exactly 10:30 p.m., completely with the highly familiar, toxic smell entirely of expensive women's perfume perfectly on his bespoke clothes. Eleanor was peacefully in the massive kitchen, happily making hot tea, visually appearing exactly as the exact same, highly submissive, pathetic woman, exactly as absolutely always. "Exactly how was your highly busy day, my beautiful love?" Alexander asked, highly distractedly kissing her completely on the pale forehead. Incredibly quiet, Eleanor responded smoothly. "I brutally worked entirely on absolutely some highly complex translations. And exactly you? Exactly how was the highly exhausting all-day massive meeting?" Alexander absolutely did not actively notice the highly sharp irony entirely in her beautiful voice. Completely, utterly exhausting. The highly demanding German clients are absolutely always so incredibly demanding. Eleanor smiled highly darkly, completely internally. entirely on Chloe's highly toxic Instagram. Proudly published exactly 3 short hours completely prior, was a highly glossy photo, entirely of a highly expensive glass, entirely of Dom Perignon, completely with the highly toxic caption, happily celebrating highly massive new projects, completely with my absolute love. The highly specific location flawlessly showed the highly exclusive Four Seasons Hotel entirely in Manhattan. Alexander, Eleanor stated completely, with the absolute most highly innocent voice she could highly successfully muster. Can I actively ask you a highly simple question? Absolutely, of course. Why exactly do you absolutely never, ever actively take me directly to your highly elite company events? I would absolutely love to successfully meet your elite colleagues, to profoundly understand your massive work significantly better. Alexander was visibly, highly incredibly uncomfortable. Eleanor, we have absolutely already actively talked completely about exactly this. They are highly, incredibly formal events. You would profoundly feel completely, utterly out of place. But exactly what if it absolutely wasn't exactly like that? What exactly if I actively wanted to fiercely try? Alexander sighed incredibly impatiently. Look, I will absolutely be completely honest entirely with you. These highly elite events absolutely treat entirely about high-level networking, entirely about flawlessly impressing massive clients, entirely about actively maintaining highly critical professional relationships. The highly elite people perfectly there, highly intelligently, talk entirely about highly complex, contemporary art, complex international politics, highly complex commercial agreements. Would you highly possibly even completely understand exactly what they were actively talking entirely about? Every single highly toxic word was a highly deliberate, calculated humiliation. But Eleanor flawlessly maintained a highly neutral, absolute expression. Do you genuinely, arrogantly think I am way too incredibly stupid to successfully follow a highly intelligent conversation entirely about complex art or global politics? It absolutely isn't a highly pathetic question entirely of pure intelligence, Eleanor. It is a highly specific question entirely of absolute environment. You were absolutely not highly raised entirely in that massive world. It is exactly like actively taking absolutely someone who has absolutely never, ever clearly heard highly complex opera directly to La Scala, entirely in Milan. The pathetic person can absolutely be incredibly intelligent, but they will absolutely, undeniably, feel completely lost. Eleanor nodded fiercely, exactly as if she completely understood and highly submissively agreed. You are absolutely right, she stated incredibly softly. I genuinely wouldn't profoundly know exactly how to flawlessly behave entirely in those highly sophisticated, elite environments. Alexander visibly appeared incredibly relieved that she had highly submissively accepted the highly toxic explanation so incredibly easily. Exactly. And there is absolutely nothing highly wrong completely with exactly that, my beautiful love. Absolutely everyone officially possesses their highly specific place entirely in the massive world. Yours is perfectly right here, safely taking absolute care entirely of our beautiful home, actively doing your highly quiet translation work. That is exactly what you are incredibly good entirely at. That exact night, Eleanor lay completely awake, perfectly, neck completely, to Alexander, smiling highly terrifyingly, completely in the pitch-black darkness. In exactly 1 short week, entirely at the highly massive gala, entirely of the Modern Art Foundation, Alexander would horrifyingly discover exactly how incredibly, catastrophically wrong he absolutely was. Entirely about the exact woman he had highly foolishly married. And Chloe would horrifyingly discover exactly what violently happens, exactly when you actively attempt to highly maliciously steal the arrogant husband entirely from a highly terrifying woman who has finally, fiercely decided to completely, violently strike back. Eleanor is getting ready for the gala. What do you think her grand entrance will look like? Drop your predictions below. The masterclass in revenge. Eleanor violently woke completely up the highly anticipated following Monday, completely with the absolute, highly lethal determination entirely of a highly elite military general aggressively preparing entirely for the absolute, ultimate, final battle. She legally possessed exactly 6 agonizing days to completely, violently transform herself absolutely entirely. And absolutely every single highly precious hour would absolutely be highly strategically, aggressively utilized. Her absolute first massive stop was a highly prestigious elite finishing school entirely in Manhattan. Exactly where she aggressively enrolled entirely in a highly intensive, highly expensive crash course, entirely in elite social protocol and high society etiquette. Flawlessly taught completely by a highly formidable, former European diplomat. The highly complex course, which absolutely normally took an entire agonizing month, would be violently, aggressively, condensed completely into exactly 5 agonizing days, exclusively for a highly select, elite group entirely of top executives. Mrs. Montgomery, the highly terrifying instructor stated. Lady Isabella, a highly aristocratic woman, entirely in her early 60s, completely with a highly aristocratic bearing and incredibly piercing, terrifying eyes. I will absolutely be incredibly direct. You officially possess exactly 5 agonizing days entirely to flawlessly learn exactly what highly elite people entirely in high society successfully learned completely throughout their absolute entire lives. There will absolutely be 0 massive time entirely for highly pathetic subtleties. We are actively going completely straight, directly to the absolute core. Eleanor aggressively absorbed every single, highly complex piece entirely of massive information, exactly like a highly desperate sponge. She meticulously learned absolutely all about the highly rigid Manhattan social hierarchy. Exactly how to flawlessly identify highly important, powerful people completely by their highly specific way, entirely of flawlessly dressing and confidently behaving. And the highly appropriate, safe conversation topics entirely for absolutely every single specific type, entirely, of elite event. She flawlessly learned absolutely all about highly expensive vintage wines, absolutely not entirely just the highly fancy names, but the highly complex histories, completely behind the highly exclusive labels, the highly specific production regions, Napa Valley, Bordeaux, the highly important, critical vintages, the absolute, highly massive difference completely between absolutely someone who truly belongs entirely to elite high society and absolutely someone who is highly pathetically faking it, Lady Isabella explicitly explained, is absolutely not entirely in exactly what you profoundly know, but entirely in exactly how you flawlessly react completely to exactly what you absolutely do, not completely know. A highly, truly, completely educated person absolutely never, ever actively tries to highly toxically impress completely with fake knowledge they absolutely do not genuinely possess. They flawlessly ask highly intelligent questions and intensely, listen completely, with highly genuine, absolute interest. Eleanor aggressively practiced highly complex conversations entirely about complex contemporary art, advanced international politics, and highly complex global economics. She flawlessly learned the absolute, highly critical difference completely between true confidence and highly toxic arrogance, completely between true elegance and highly vulgar ostentation, in highly strict parallel, completely with the complex course. Eleanor confidently went absolutely daily directly to the absolute most highly exclusive, elite fitness center entirely in Manhattan, exactly where she highly expensively hired an elite personal trainer who brutally worked exclusively with elite supermodels and highly famous actresses. "Madam," stated Marcus, the elite trainer, "you officially possess an absolutely incredible, flawless bone structure, completely with the absolute right, grueling work. Entirely in exactly 1 short week, you will absolutely possess the highly intimidating posture, entirely of a highly elite, international supermodel." They brutally worked incredibly intensely, entirely on her flawless posture, her highly confident, lethal walk, and her highly calculated, elegant gestures. Eleanor flawlessly learned exactly how to confidently enter a massive room, exactly as if she completely, utterly owned the absolute place. Exactly how to confidently greet highly important, terrifying people completely, without visually appearing highly intimidated. And exactly how to beautifully smile entirely in a highly specific way that flawlessly demonstrated absolute confidence completely, without visually appearing highly arrogant. On the highly agonizing 4th day entirely of her massive preparation, Eleanor fiercely did absolutely something she absolutely never, ever genuinely thought she would absolutely be highly capable entirely of actively doing. She highly expensively hired a highly elite, private investigator. She desperately wanted to absolutely be completely, 100% absolutely sure, entirely, of absolutely every single microscopic detail, entirely of Alexander's highly toxic double life, completely before the highly explosive final confrontation. The elite investigator, a highly terrifying former federal agent explicitly named Robert Vance, flawlessly delivered a highly thick report that completely, violently exceeded absolutely even Eleanor's absolute worst, most terrifying expectations. Alexander absolutely wasn't entirely just actively cheating completely on her, entirely with Chloe, completely for the absolute last 18 agonizing months. He had meticulously created an absolute, complete, parallel massive life. He legally possessed a highly expensive rented luxury apartment, exactly where he highly comfortably spent the agonizing nights, exactly when he highly toxically stated he was brutally working incredibly late. He legally possessed a highly secure, separate bank account, exactly where he highly illegally deposited highly massive portions entirely of his massive annual bonuses. He had absolutely even highly expensively hired a highly terrifying divorce lawyer exactly 3 agonizing months completely prior. But the absolute most highly devastating, toxic information was completely on the absolute last heavy pages entirely of the massive report. Alexander had highly legally promised entirely to seamlessly marry Chloe entirely in June, entirely of the absolute following year. He had absolutely already highly expensively reserved a highly historic church and a highly luxurious 5-star resort entirely for their highly romantic honeymoon. He actively planned to aggressively ask entirely for the brutal divorce, completely from Eleanor. Exactly right. Completely after the highly festive holidays. Highly falsely, alleging highly toxic, irreconcilable differences, and that they had highly toxically grown completely apart, entirely in highly different directions. The elite lawyer had absolutely already meticulously developed a highly toxic strategy, entirely, to aggressively minimize the highly complex division entirely of massive assets, highly maliciously exploiting the highly toxic fact that Eleanor had absolutely not actively contributed highly significantly, entirely, to the massive wealth entirely of the toxic couple. Eleanor laughed incredibly, highly bitterly exactly, as she agonizingly read this highly toxic information. Alexander truly, genuinely, arrogantly thought that she was a highly defenseless, pathetic fool who would highly submissively accept absolutely whatever highly pathetic, tiny crumbs he highly arrogantly offered. The exact day, completely before the massive gala, Eleanor meticulously made her highly final, absolute preparations. She confidently visited a highly exclusive, elite high-end jewelry store. Absolutely not entirely to actively buy, but entirely to fiercely learn. She highly intelligently spoke completely with the elite manager entirely about the absolute most highly exclusive, rare pieces entirely in the massive collection. She flawlessly learned absolutely all about the highly complex history entirely of the massive brand, the highly rare materials seamlessly used, and the absolute most highly important elite designers. You successfully possess an incredibly highly refined taste, the elite manager smoothly commented, exactly when Eleanor flawlessly demonstrated highly advanced knowledge entirely about a highly limited collection entirely of incredibly rare, massive diamonds. Do you actively work entirely in the highly exclusive field entirely of fine jewelry? No, Eleanor responded completely with a highly enigmatic, beautiful smile. I am absolutely only a highly observant woman who is actively learning exactly how to truly value highly beautiful, rare things. That exact night, entirely on the highly tense eve, entirely of the massive gala, Alexander confidently arrived completely home, significantly earlier than highly usual. He was visibly, incredibly nervous, highly constantly, frantically checking his expensive phone. Are you perfectly okay, my beautiful love? Eleanor asked, completely with highly fake, toxic concern. Yes. Yes, it is absolutely just that exactly tomorrow there is a highly important, massive corporate event. I could highly likely confidently arrive incredibly late. What exact specific kind entirely of massive event? Alexander violently hesitated entirely for exactly one highly brief moment. A highly boring charity gala, incredibly formal, highly tedious. You would absolutely violently hate it. Eleanor nodded fiercely, highly sympathetically. Absolutely, of course. I genuinely hope absolutely everything successfully goes perfectly well. That exact night, Eleanor actively took a highly long, luxurious bath and intensely looked directly at herself completely in the massive mirror, entirely for the absolute last time, exactly as the highly pathetic old Eleanor, the highly terrifying woman who intensely looked directly back, was absolutely already, completely, utterly different, completely from the pathetic woman who had horrifyingly discovered the massive betrayal exactly one agonizing week completely prior. The highly sharp, modern haircut, the incredibly straight, lethal posture, the highly determined, piercing gaze, but absolute most importantly, the massive, unbreakable confidence that violently radiated completely from deeply within. On the highly anticipated morning entirely of the massive gala, Alexander confidently left incredibly early, toxically explicitly stating that he possessed highly stressful meetings the absolute entire day, completely before the massive event. Eleanor profoundly knew that he would absolutely spend the entire day completely with Chloe, happily helping her meticulously prepare, expensively buying exotic flowers, perhaps absolutely even a highly special, expensive jewel explicitly for the highly special occasion. Eleanor successfully spent her entire day entirely in a highly exclusive, elite luxury spa, a highly relaxing, expensive massage, a highly advanced facial treatment, an absolutely perfect, flawless manicure and pedicure. At exactly 5 p.m., she confidently went directly to her elite salon entirely for the highly final, flawless hairstyle and highly professional, elite makeup. Francesco, the highly dramatic hairstylist who had brilliantly done her massive transformation, was completely, utterly, blown completely away entirely by the highly stunning, absolute final result. Mamma mia, you are completely, utterly unrecognizable. You visually look exactly like a highly famous elite international actress. The elite makeup artist, a highly sophisticated Frenchwoman explicitly named Celine, who regularly brutally worked completely with massive celebrities, flawlessly created a highly sophisticated but incredibly natural look. Highly luminous, flawless skin, highly elegant, striking eyes, and highly classic, bold red lips that flawlessly, perfectly complemented the highly stunning dress that Eleanor would fiercely wear. At exactly 7 p.m., Eleanor was completely, flawlessly ready. The highly stunning black bespoke Armani dress perfectly, flawlessly hugged her completely toned body. The highly expensive Christian Louboutin stilettos flawlessly added massive height and absolute, lethal elegance. The highly exclusive Bottega Veneta clutch was a highly flawless, final touch entirely of highly discreet sophistication. But the absolute most highly important, massive accessory that Eleanor fiercely wore was completely invisible. Her highly terrifying, brand new absolute self-confidence. In the highly comfortable taxi entirely on the way directly to the Modern Art Foundation, Eleanor mentally, meticulously, reviewed absolutely all the highly complex information she had aggressively absorbed entirely in the absolute last agonizing week. She profoundly knew that Alexander would absolutely be perfectly there, completely with Chloe. She profoundly knew that it would absolutely be a highly public, highly explosive confrontation. She profoundly knew that their entire lives would absolutely, never, ever successfully be the exact same, completely, after that highly explosive night. But entirely for the absolute first time in exactly 8 agonizing years, entirely of highly toxic marriage, Eleanor was absolutely not completely afraid. She was completely, utterly ready. Entirely to fiercely show Alexander, Chloe, and the absolute entire, highly elite high society, entirely of massive New York exactly who Eleanor Davis truly, genuinely was. Eleanor is finally at the gala. How do you think Alexander will react when he sees her? Tell us your predictions below. The public execution. The highly expensive taxi smoothly stopped perfectly in front, entirely of the highly imposing, massive building entirely of the elite foundation. Eleanor gracefully stepped completely out, entirely of the massive car, completely with the absolute, lethal grace entirely of a terrifying queen, and confidently walked directly toward the grand entrance, exactly where the highly aggressive social photographers meticulously documented the highly elite arrival entirely of the massive guests. When Eleanor flawlessly appeared entirely at the absolute top, entirely of the massive stairs, there was a highly notable, massive moment entirely of absolute, dead silence. Highly sophisticated conversations completely, violently stopped. Highly arrogant heads violently turned, and highly blinding cameras aggressively fired. Eleanor smiled incredibly slightly and gracefully descended the massive stairs completely, with the highly absolute confidence entirely of absolutely someone who had absolutely always perfectly belonged entirely to that highly exclusive, massive world. Alexander. Alexander absolutely had not vividly seen her completely yet. She highly sharply spotted him completely on the absolute other side entirely of the massive main hall, visually looking highly elegant, entirely in his bespoke tuxedo, loudly laughing entirely at absolutely something highly amusing Chloe had happily said. Chloe was visually looking highly dazzling, entirely, in a highly expensive gold designer dress that highly likely cost significantly more than a highly expensive luxury car. But Eleanor highly sharply noticed absolutely something massive that her highly intensive, elite training had flawlessly taught her to vividly see. Chloe was actively trying way too incredibly hard. The massive jewelry was incredibly excessive, entirely for the highly specific occasion. The highly expensive makeup was just a tiny bit way too incredibly heavy. And the highly revealing dress was way too incredibly flashy, entirely for a highly sophisticated cultural event. Chloe was incredibly beautiful and highly elegant. But there was a highly obvious, undeniable touch entirely of highly vulgar, new money, entirely in her highly flashy presentation that highly truly sophisticated elite people would absolutely immediately, highly toxically, notice. Eleanor, entirely on the absolute other hand, had flawlessly learned the highly absolute golden rule entirely of pure elegance. Less is absolutely more. She confidently headed directly to the highly exclusive bar and politely ordered a highly classic Negroni. Absolutely not entirely because she highly particularly liked it, but entirely because she had flawlessly learned that it was a highly classic, incredibly sophisticated elite drink. While she highly patiently waited, she highly intelligently complimented the elite bartender and highly knowledgeably commented entirely on the highly complex architecture entirely of the massive building. It was exactly at that highly precise moment that she physically felt a highly intense, burning gaze, violently fixed completely upon her. She smoothly turned completely around and vividly saw Alexander confidently standing exactly a few short meters, completely away, completely, with a highly terrifying look, entirely of absolute, total shock, perfectly on his handsome face. For exactly one highly brief moment, Eleanor genuinely thought he absolutely had not vividly recognized her. When he finally, horrifyingly did, the highly arrogant expression violently changed completely from massive confusion directly to absolute, total, blinding incredulity. Eleanor smiled highly serenely, smoothly took her expensive drink, and confidently walked directly toward the exact toxic husband who had aggressively spent agonizing months meticulously planning to violently leave her. The highly explosive war was actively about to violently begin. Alexander was completely, utterly paralyzed exactly as Eleanor confidently approached. His piercing eyes frantically scanned the highly terrifying, transformed appearance entirely of his exact wife, exactly as if he were actively seeing a highly terrifying ghost. The highly expensive tuxedo that had absolutely always visually made him seem so incredibly imposing, suddenly, violently appeared incredibly ordinary, perfectly next, completely to the highly devastating, absolute elegance that Eleanor aggressively radiated. "Good highly evening, Alexander," Eleanor stated completely with a highly lethal smile that absolutely did not successfully reach her freezing eyes. Her beautiful voice was incredibly calm and highly controlled, completely with a highly sophisticated, elite tone that he had absolutely never, ever clearly heard completely before. "Eleanor, what exactly are you actively doing exactly here?" Alexander violently stammered, highly nervously looking directly toward the side exactly where Chloe was happily talking completely, with a highly elite group entirely of wealthy women, perfectly near the massive artworks. "Exactly the exact same thing, exactly as you, I highly safely imagine. Deeply appreciating highly complex contemporary art. Actively meeting highly interesting elite people. Enthusiastically participating entirely in the highly exclusive cultural life entirely of massive New York." Eleanor highly elegantly took a highly slow sip entirely of her classic Negroni, flawlessly maintaining highly direct, freezing eye contact. "Or is there absolutely any massive problem completely with my highly legitimate presence perfectly here?" Alexander desperately attempted to miraculously compose completely himself, but he was visibly, completely, deeply shaken. "No, absolutely, of course not. It is absolutely just that. You absolutely never, ever actively showed absolutely any massive interest entirely in these highly specific types entirely of elite events. How incredibly interesting." Eleanor gently tilted her beautiful head incredibly slightly. "I absolutely never, ever actively showed massive interest, or you absolutely never, ever generously gave me the highly fair opportunity to actively show it." Before Alexander could highly successfully respond, Eleanor was violently interrupted completely by a highly toxic female voice directly behind him. "Alexander, my beautiful love, exactly who is your highly interesting friend?" Chloe had confidently approached and was exactly now confidently standing perfectly next, completely, to Alexander, aggressively passing her slender arm highly possessively, completely around him. She was absolutely even significantly more incredibly beautiful entirely in person than entirely in the highly edited photos. But Eleanor immediately, highly sharply noticed exactly what her highly elite training had flawlessly taught her to vividly see. Chloe was absolutely spectacular, but there was absolutely something incredibly artificial entirely in her highly flashy beauty. The highly excessively filled lips, the highly clearly surgical enhancements, the highly fake toxic tan that absolutely did not flawlessly match the freezing New York winter. "Chloe," Alexander violently swallowed incredibly hard. This is officially Eleanor." "Eleanor!" Chloe highly arrogantly extended her soft hand completely with a highly condescending, toxic smile. "Highly enchanted. Do you actively work entirely in the highly complex arts?" Eleanor fiercely shook Chloe's soft hand incredibly firmly, flawlessly maintaining her highly elegant, lethal smile. "I am officially a highly successful literary translator, and you, Chloe, absolutely must officially be the highly pathetic model who has absolutely been actively sleeping completely with my arrogant husband entirely for the absolute last 18 agonizing months." The highly heavy, suffocating silence that violently followed was absolutely deafening. Alexander violently turned exactly as incredibly pale, exactly as a highly terrifying ghost. Chloe violently withdrew her soft hand, exactly as if she had literally just been brutally given a highly lethal electric shock. And several elite people perfectly nearby completely stopped actively talking entirely to highly eagerly pay intense attention. "Your arrogant husband?" Chloe intensely looked completely from Eleanor directly to Alexander, completely with highly massive growing confusion. "Alexander, you explicitly told me that you were completely, officially divorced exactly 2 agonizing years, completely ago." "Divorced?" Eleanor laughed incredibly softly, highly toxically. "How incredibly curious, Alexander. Exactly when did this highly secret divorce exactly officially occur? It absolutely must have highly miraculously happened exactly while I was deeply asleep. Entirely because we were absolutely still highly legally married exactly when you confidently left our massive house this exact morning." Alexander desperately attempted to violently intervene, highly frantically. "Eleanor, please, let's actively talk completely and highly private." "Why?" Eleanor aggressively raised her beautiful voice exactly just highly enough to successfully attract even significantly more massive, elite attention. "For exactly 18 agonizing months, you highly privately talked completely with Chloe entirely about our highly private marriage. You highly maliciously told her we were completely divorced. You highly illegally spent our massive money entirely to highly expensively maintain her. And you highly arrogantly brought her directly to the exact elite events, exactly where you highly toxically, explicitly stated I would absolutely be completely out of place. I genuinely think we have absolutely already actively had highly sufficient massive private conversations. Don't you genuinely think? By exactly now, a highly notable, massive circle entirely of highly elite people was actively, intensely paying absolute attention completely to the highly explosive conversation. Eleanor vividly recognized highly several elite faces, completely from the highly exclusive social photos she had meticulously studied. Massive corporate businessmen, elite artists, and highly influential journalists. Chloe was visibly, incredibly confused, and highly, violently irritated. "Alexander, what exactly the hell is she actively talking entirely about? You explicitly told me that your highly pathetic, simple ex-wife actively lived entirely in the pathetic country, and completely with whom you absolutely no longer possessed absolutely any massive contact." Ex-wife. Eleanor highly mockingly feigned massive surprise. "Alexander, you explicitly told your highly pathetic mistress that I am officially your highly pathetic ex-wife. How incredibly, fascinatingly interesting. Highly considering that completely last night you peacefully slept entirely in our massive bed, entirely in our massive house, completely after highly lovingly kissing me, and highly toxically, explicitly saying, 'Good night, my beautiful love.'" Alexander was visibly, violently, profusely sweating. "Eleanor, are you actively, highly maliciously making a massive public scene?" "I am actively making a highly public scene." Eleanor laughed completely with highly genuine, toxic bitterness. "Alexander, entirely for 8 agonizing years, you highly toxically maliciously made me genuinely believe that I absolutely wasn't incredibly sophisticated enough to highly publicly appear completely with you. That I was way too incredibly simple, way too incredibly rural, way too incredibly inadequate entirely for your highly exclusive, elite social circle." She actively took a highly dramatic, massive pause, intensely looking directly at the highly captive audience that had violently formed. "Do you profoundly know exactly what I horrifyingly discovered this exact week? The massive problem absolutely never was that I absolutely wasn't incredibly sophisticated enough. The highly toxic problem was that you desperately needed a highly diminished, pathetic woman simply to highly arrogantly feel superior. Chloe was actively beginning to profoundly understand the highly explosive situation, and her beautiful expression violently changed completely from massive confusion directly to pure, white-hot fury. "Alexander, are you actively still legally married? You maliciously made me the highly pathetic mistress entirely of a married man, entirely for a massive 1.5 years. Chloe, generously, let me flawlessly explain. Explain exactly what?" Chloe was completely, violently losing her highly polished, elegant composure. "That you have absolutely been maliciously lying completely to me, completely from the absolute first massive day? That you have maliciously made me visually look exactly like an absolute, pathetic idiot, entirely in absolutely every single elite event, exactly where you highly proudly presented me, exactly as your beautiful girlfriend?" Eleanor intensely observed the highly explosive scene completely, with highly massive, growing satisfaction. Chloe was aggressively doing exactly, precisely exactly, what she had highly meticulously expected. Violently losing absolute emotional control, completely in public. Flawlessly revealing her absolute, highly toxic true nature, completely beneath the highly fake facade, entirely of elite sophistication. "Actually, Chloe," Eleanor smoothly intervened completely with a highly soft, lethal voice, "you absolutely never, ever visually looked exactly like a highly pathetic idiot. You visually looked exactly, precisely exactly, like exactly what you truly are. A highly pathetic woman who highly willingly accepts actively being completely maintained entirely by a highly married man, entirely an absolute exchange, completely for highly expensive designer bags and highly luxurious, expensive trips. The highly lethal insult was flawlessly delivered completely with such incredible, absolute elegance that it actively took exactly a few highly agonizing seconds entirely for Chloe to completely, fully process it. When she finally profoundly understood, her highly violent reaction was completely explosive. "Who exactly the hell do you highly arrogantly think you are, entirely to highly insult me? Alexander explicitly told me absolutely everything entirely about you. A highly pathetic, failed woman who absolutely never, ever successfully achieved absolutely anything entirely in massive life, completely beyond highly pathetically translating highly insignificant texts. Insignificant texts." Eleanor beautifully smiled completely with highly genuine, absolute superiority. "Chloe, my beautiful darling, entirely while you were highly pathetically publishing cheap bikini photos entirely on Instagram, I was successfully, brilliantly translating Virginia Woolf and Ian McEwan directly for highly important, elite international audiences. While you highly toxically depended entirely on my arrogant husband's massive money, entirely to successfully maintain your highly fake, expensive lifestyle. I was highly successfully, actively building a highly respected, elite career entirely in the highly complex cultural field." Eleanor violently paused, intensely looking directly at Chloe completely, from top entirely to bottom completely, with highly elegant, freezing disdain. "Do you profoundly know exactly what the absolute, fundamental, massive difference completely between us truly is? You are a highly beautiful, purely decorative, but highly easily replaceable, pathetic accessory. I am officially the absolute, undisputed protagonist entirely of my absolute own massive story. Chloe furiously attempted to aggressively respond. But Eleanor absolutely had not completely finished. She smoothly turned completely back directly toward her highly toxic husband, who was clearly completely in a massive state, entirely of pure, unadulterated shock. You explicitly told Chloe that I was completely inadequate, entirely for highly elite events exactly like this, that I absolutely wouldn't profoundly know exactly how to flawlessly behave entirely in high society, that I absolutely wouldn't completely understand highly complex conversations entirely about art, politics, or elite culture. Eleanor flawlessly made a highly elegant sweeping gesture completely toward the massive luxurious surroundings. Well, exactly here I absolutely am. Completely in the exact same highly elite event, exactly as you. Highly intelligently talking entirely about highly complex, contemporary art, completely with highly important people that you highly arrogantly consider incredibly important. Flawlessly wearing bespoke Armani, elegantly drinking a highly classic Negroni, flawlessly behaving precisely exactly, like absolutely any completely other highly sophisticated woman perfectly here. She confidently approached significantly closer completely to Alexander, violently lowering her deep voice, but flawlessly maintaining it highly perfectly audible entirely for absolutely everyone completely around. Do you profoundly know exactly what this highly explosive moment flawlessly proves? That I was absolutely always completely capable entirely of seamlessly belonging completely to this massive world. You are the absolute pathetic coward who desperately needed to violently keep me incredibly small, simply to highly arrogantly feel massive. You are the exact pathetic man who desperately needed a highly diminished, pathetic wife entirely to toxically justify your highly pathetic need, entirely for a highly cheap mistress who would toxically inflate your highly fragile, pathetic ego. Alexander frantically attempted exactly one absolute last, highly desperate time. Eleanor, don't you completely understand? I completely understand, absolutely perfectly. Eleanor violently interrupted him. You are an absolute pathetic coward. A highly toxic man who absolutely does not possess the highly basic courage entirely to bravely assume his highly toxic choices. Who maliciously lies completely to exactly two beautiful women, highly simultaneously. Who highly toxically builds his highly fragile self-esteem entirely on the absolute, brutal humiliation entirely of completely other innocent people. She smoothly turned directly back entirely to Chloe, who was visibly, frantically, desperately attempting to aggressively control hot tears entirely of pure anger and absolute, complete humiliation. And you, my beautiful darling, are exactly, precisely, the exact type, entirely, of highly pathetic woman who highly willingly accepts the highly pathetic crumbs entirely of a highly toxic man, entirely because she absolutely does not genuinely believe that she fiercely deserves the highly massive main course. You highly willingly settled entirely for actively being completely hidden, completely with actively being highly toxically presented, completely with highly malicious half-truths, completely with actively being highly expensively maintained exactly like a highly expensive, pathetic doll. Eleanor smoothly finished her highly expensive drink and gracefully placed the highly empty glass completely on a highly passing elite tray. Now, if you will highly generously excuse me, I am actively going to successfully continue highly happily enjoying this highly magnificent, beautiful evening. Completely after all. This is exactly, precisely, the exact type entirely of highly elite event that Alexander absolutely, always toxically, explicitly stated that I would absolutely never, ever profoundly know exactly how to successfully appreciate. Eleanor confidently walked completely away, completely, with the absolute, highly lethal elegance, entirely, of an untouchable queen. Ruthlessly leaving completely behind a completely, utterly destroyed Alexander, and a violently crying, humiliated Chloe, for the absolute rest entirely of the highly magical night. Eleanor was the absolute, undisputed center entirely of massive attention. She highly intelligently spoke, completely with elite diplomats, entirely about highly complex Portuguese literature. Completely with elite art critics, entirely about the highly complex influence, entirely of modern architecture, entirely on contemporary art. And completely with highly powerful corporate businessmen, entirely about highly lucrative cultural opportunities, completely between Spain and Italy. She successfully, highly triumphantly, received exactly 5 highly exclusive invitations directly to future elite events. Exactly 3 highly lucrative, elite job offers. And exactly 2 highly expensive business cards, completely from highly elegant, powerful men, highly interested, entirely, in successfully getting to profoundly know her significantly better. Alexander and Chloe violently abandoned the massive event, completely separately. Absolutely both, completely, publicly, and irreversibly humiliated. The aftermath of revenge. Exactly 3 agonizing weeks, significantly later, Alexander confidently appeared perfectly at her highly secure apartment, highly pathetically begging entirely to actively talk. Eleanor highly coldly received him completely, with the exact same, highly freezing elegance that she had flawlessly demonstrated entirely at the massive gala. You were completely, 100% absolutely right, entirely about absolutely everything, he highly pathetically admitted. Completely, with his piercing eyes violently bright red, completely from absolutely not peacefully sleeping entirely in agonizing days. I am an absolute, pathetic coward. I violently destroyed the absolute best massive thing entirely of my entire life, entirely out of highly toxic insecurity and massive arrogance. Chloe violently left me, Alexander aggressively continued. She explicitly said that I highly publicly humiliated her, that she could absolutely never, ever actively show her beautiful face entirely in elite society completely again, entirely after exactly what violently happened. And she was 100% absolutely right. Alexander, Eleanor stated incredibly softly, you successfully taught me a highly valuable, massive lesson entirely about my absolute own, massive worth. Thank you so incredibly much entirely for exactly that. Eleanor, can we highly possibly actively try completely again? I have miraculously changed. I absolutely have not. The highly firm response was completely absolute, but absolutely not highly cruel. You absolutely have not miraculously changed, Alexander. You have absolutely only horrifyingly discovered the highly catastrophic consequences entirely of your highly toxic choices. And I beautifully discovered that I can absolutely be incredibly happy, completely, without you. In highly actual fact, I am significantly, infinitely happier, completely, without you. Exactly 6 beautiful months, significantly later. Eleanor was happily living entirely in a highly modern, highly luxurious loft, entirely in the highly trendy neighborhood, entirely of Tribeca. Completely with a highly prosperous, elite career, exactly as a highly respected cultural translator. And her absolute own, highly successful book, highly officially published entirely about her highly inspiring experience, entirely of massive personal rebirth. Alexander highly frantically, desperately attempted to miraculously rebuild his highly ruined social reputation. But the highly massive, public humiliation entirely at the massive gala had completely, permanently scarred him entirely in the highly exclusive, elegant circles entirely of massive New York. Chloe highly rapidly moved completely far, far away, exactly where she highly pathetically, desperately attempted to miraculously restart her highly toxic influencer career, completely far entirely from the highly malicious, toxic gossip, entirely of elite Manhattan society. And Eleanor finally, profoundly understood that absolute, true elegance, absolutely, does not magically come completely from highly expensive designer dresses or highly complex knowledge entirely about vintage wines. It miraculously comes entirely from the absolute, unbreakable courage entirely to profoundly know your absolute own massive worth, and the highly terrifying absolute strength entirely to absolutely never, ever willingly accept anything highly less than exactly what you fiercely deserve. The absolute, sweetest, massive revenge absolutely wasn't completely destroying Alexander highly publicly. It was miraculously, beautifully discovering that she had absolutely always been completely, utterly extraordinary. She absolutely only desperately needed to completely stop, highly willingly accepting the highly diminished, pathetic version entirely of herself that highly toxic others actively, aggressively attempted to highly maliciously impose. Eleanor Davis absolutely did not entirely just miraculously survive the massive betrayal. She beautifully, flawlessly flourished. And beautifully discovered that absolutely some highly powerful women are absolutely not magically born to actively be highly pathetic secondary characters, entirely in absolutely anyone's massive story. They are miraculously born to absolutely be the absolute, undisputed protagonists entirely of their absolute own, highly epic, massive lives. What an absolutely incredible, breathtaking masterclass in ultimate revenge. Do you guys fiercely think Eleanor's public execution of Alexander and Chloe was exactly what they deserved? Would you have taken him back after he begged? Drop your fierce thoughts in the comments below. Please don't forget to smash that like button, share this incredible story of empowerment, and subscribe to our channel for more explosive, satisfying stories. See you in the next one.